Hello, my name is Virgil, and this is Literally Books. Today I want to talk about Angela Carter's short story collection, The Bloody Chamber. It has 10 short stories in here. This was recommended to me by Chris at Liminal Spaces in a discussion that we had in my Tanith Lee video, saying Angela Carter sort of retold a lot of fairy tales, and that it sounds like Tanith Lee's writing is reminiscent of Angela Carter. And I asked for recommendation. He said this book, The Bloody Chamber. I really enjoyed it. There will be a little bit of spoiling, but I think I'm going to try to keep it minimum. I'm going to talk about the setup for each one of those stories, but I don't think it's going to ruin anything. These stories don't rely on a surprise ending or something like that. For most cases, I could identify what fairy tale we were revisiting fairly early. And from there, it's not what happens or like what the plot is, but how we arrive at the plot. I really enjoyed the writing here. It is very ornate. I want to say that it's dense, but it's not dense in the way that it's like hard to... it's not dense as so much that it's hard to understand or it's very difficult to sort of figure out what's happening. It's dense, not like a precious metal is dense, but dense the way that pound cake or like really luxurious fabrics are dense, right? The thing that I kept thinking about this is this book is kind of like a really good piece of wedding cake, right? This really thick, just perfectly sweet icing on there, and this amazing cake and all these different layers and everything is wonderful, but one piece is enough, right? It's very rich and one piece is enough for you. More than that and it would be too much, but you don't want a little piece of it. You want the right size, and I think this is a really great size of cake, so to speak, but that makes it sound I really enjoyed it. But the writing is very decadent, very decorated, very Baroque. Yeah, there's a good word. The other thing I want to bring up is that this book is just, I don't know why I keep coming to this way to say it, but this book is just dripping, with sexual imagery. It really is. Even the title, The Bloody Chamber, is a sexual reference. It's not erotica. I think erotica goes after the erotic act. That's what it's interested in getting to or talking about. And that's not really the case here. But I think it's more that Carter doesn't shy away from that. She doesn't shy away from talking about something that's on the character's mind, if that's what they're talking about, right? When she sees conversation or something that really is more about sex, then she just talks about it. She just goes to it, or she definitely suggests it with her descriptions. Every one of these stories has a lot of sexual imagery in them. So we'll go through the stories, and I'll kind of just talk a little bit about each one, and then we can kind of wrap it up at the end. So the first story is The Bloody Chamber. The Bloody Chamber is a retelling of Bluebeard the Pirate. Okay, so you can plug your ears for a second if you don't know the story of Bluebeard, but I think I would think as an adult you probably do, and if you don't, I would say you'd kind of want to know that story, the story of Bluebeard, before you read The Bloody Chamber. I think that it benefits from I think it expects or anticipates that you would know that story already. Of course, the story of Bluebeard is about a pirate who marries a woman. He's been married many times before, but all his wives are gone missing or dead. And when he marries his most recent young bride, he tells her, "Don't look in my cabinet. I keep it locked." Obviously, that's the first thing she wants to do. So when he's not around, she opens it up and discovers the severed heads of all his previous wives. Right? And then there's some sort of bloody conclusion to that. So The Bloody Chamber is a retelling of that. And as I said, it's really not talking about the Bluebeard's Bloody Chamber per se as it is the virginal Bloody Chamber of the young girl in the story who marries a much older man and moves to, I think it's the coast of France where he has a castle. And I guess it's a good time to talk about how even though that is sort of going through some of the motions of that story, that it doesn't mean that there's sort of like this fatalistic path that the female protagonist has to go down. There's in every one of these stories, something I really liked is that the protagonist always seems to be slightly empowered in the end. They make the choice to do whatever is going to happen. Maybe the situation is out of their control, but ultimately that character has some agency. They get to decide what's going to happen. It's not just forced upon them and they have to endure it. And that's something I really liked. That all these characters get to decide what's going to happen to them. The next story, The Courtship of Mr. Lion, is referencing Beauty and the Beast. Of course, it's not set in the exact, like in the same sort of time as the dog goes crazy, as the it's not exactly set in the same sort of time as the Beauty and the Beast animated film. It seems like it's set a little bit later. And there's not really any explanation given for Mr. Lion, per se. I like that. These stories all have a magical realism quality to them. You know, these fairy tale creatures their existence isn't questioned. Nobody's saying, well, that's impossible because of science. Nobody says those sorts of things. It's just sort of, this is the way it is. These fairy tale creatures live right alongside us, just like in a fairy tale. Little Red Riding Hood doesn't question the fact that the wolf can talk. Somebody is getting barked at. The Tiger's Bride is about a young woman and her father traveling. They used to be very wealthy, and her father starts traveling and becomes very into gambling, and essentially gambles her away to a sort of tiger man. I like that story too. These are all really good stories, very interesting stories. Another thing with these stories is that I really do feel that they're really meant to be reread. I think that you should read them and then give them some time and then maybe even go back and read them again. I think they benefit from a second reading, which is why I feel like it's not that important to worry about knowing what fairy tale is being referenced as it is to know sort of where the story is going and what it's doing. Because you can appreciate what Angela Carter is doing with her imagery earlier in the story once you know where she ends up at the end. Puss in Boots. The Puss in Boots was very weird. It was very weird. It was very funny, very bawdy tale, right? It had a much different, much lighter, much sillier, much crazier, a rompish tone to it. That's the story that was maybe the closest to erotica, I guess you could say. Puss is trying to get his master, who is very in love with a woman. He's trying to get him in her good graces. We'll just leave it at that. The Earl King. Now, this story is interesting because I realized when I read this that I had read Angela Carter before. I'd read The Earl King before, and I didn't like it. So it was interesting all this time later, some 20-something years later, I'm rereading it, and I appreciate why it is a good story and maybe why I didn't like it. And I think this is a good way time for me to sort of talk about where I almost have a criticism, but it's not exactly a criticism. Is that sometimes, and I think The Earl King's a good example, the story is so heavy with imagery and metaphor that we don't have much of a story behind it. It's just this sort of wire frame underneath it. And The Earl King is kind of a good example because not a whole lot happens in that story. But Angela Carter's saying a lot with the imagery and sort of picture that she paints, less with what happens in, like, as far as the action, so to speak, right? Less about the plot points and more about what she's saying with her symbolism. And and so I understand why I sort of didn't like that story. A younger version of me didn't like that story, and how I like it now, how I think it works. These are not stories to hurry through and read quickly. I would definitely say to take your time with them. The Earl King's a really good example of that. Well, I didn't tell you what the Earl King was about. It's a hard one to sum up. It's sort of this sort of like fairy king almost, who this woman is sort of in love with, or maybe slightly infatuated with. It's very strange, very bizarre. He's almost like an elf or something that lives in the woods, and she becomes, I don't know, I'm not certain if she becomes obsessed with him, or if she just sort of is obsessed with what he can do and what he is. And she goes there and has, she sleeps with him and everything. But it's not altogether certain if it's very pleasant, but it's definitely, again, her choice. It's not that she's seduced. She's not. It's her choice, but it's hard to understand. It's not exactly easy for me to explain why it is that she wants to go and be with the Earl King, that she wants to go to his house. The Snow Child is about this. It talks about a wealthy couple sort of on this ride through the snow, and it's honestly it felt less like a story as it did like a poem or a poetic idea, sort of given prose form. That's the closest thing I can bring up to it, because this like older wealthy couple is like traveling, and the husband is like summoning up like young women from the snow, and his wife is very annoyed by this, and so like tries to find ways to either kill her or otherwise get rid of her. And it definitely feels as though it's saying something about the ultra wealthy and how they view everyone who isn't one of them. At least that's what the impression that I got out of it. Even though that's my impression, I kind of feel like if I read that story again, I'd get more out of it. And I think that's what I like about these stories, because I did reread a few of them before I did this review, most of the last ones, and it really made me appreciate how many times you could revisit the story, and how nice it is to sort of fall back into it. And that's one thing I really like about Angela Carter's writing, is that it's really easy to fall completely back into those stories. She pulls you in so quickly, right? So completely. You're so inundated with all these sensory inputs, right? Sights and smells and tastes and sounds. It definitely, it's like she evokes all of your senses, and it just draws you completely in. And I have honestly never read anyone write using all this imagery and land every single one of those metaphors. Like, there's never a missed opportunity here. She never tries, she never reaches for an association, I feel like, in her writing, and doesn't grab you, doesn't pull you in, doesn't make you smell that, taste that, touch that with her. And I thought that was just so impressive. I just couldn't believe how expertly she was able to do that. The next story, The Lady of the House of Love. Now this, the introduction to this book is done by Kelly Link, who writes fantasy. I don't exactly, I think she's won an award for fantasy and maybe for horror, but I'm not certain about horror. I've never actually read anything by Kelly Link. I'm interested. This got me interested to check out some of her stuff. But she says that she really likes that story, The Woman of the House of Love, and it really is good. But it's a story about a vampire, and how she lives in this sort of abandoned Romanian town, and how this young man, right before World War I, and he's sort of riding his bike through the countryside, and he comes to this town, and he is drawn up to the castle by this vampiress's maidservant, who brings him up to the castle. And what I like about the pre-World War I thing is that there's a sense that Carter says something along the lines of that the world has a fate in store for the young men of this generation, and that this young man will meet that fate in the trenches of France or something. And I really liked that there's sort of like he's not going to meet his end here. His death is already sort of foretold in France. It still makes for a really interesting story. And what I think is really great about that story is that the vampire in the story doesn't want to be a vampire, but we don't get her sort of whining about it. In fact, we get very little of her conversation, but you can see she's sort of bored with it. I feel like she feels trapped by who and what she is, and that she enjoys seeing other things trapped. I really liked it. It was really good. And a really great example of this idea really drawn out and looked at very carefully. The next story is The Werewolf. And this story and the next story, The Company of Wolves, kind of go together. I don't know that they were published together, but they kind of go together. They flow nicely into each other. In fact, the next three stories sort of flow nicely into each other. There's just a very short sort of musing about werewolves. And then, of course, The Company of Wolves is about a sort of Red Riding Hood story where the wolf is a werewolf. That's my favorite. I mean, The Company of Wolves, I think, is my absolute favorite in this collection. And what I really liked is that story, the werewolf, the story entitled The Werewolf just before that, and The Company of Wolves have a sense of thinking about what werewolves are and sort of delving into it, sort of playing with it, sort of talking about it a bit. It reminds me most strongly of like Moby Dick, where Herman Melville talks about the whiteness of the whale and how much worse and how much more frightening whiteness as a representative of death and danger is than black. That's a really well-known chapter from Moby Dick, or it even reminds me of Dorothy Scarborough in her introduction or sort of prologue to her book The Wind, where she talks long form about the wind itself and almost giving like a supernatural sort of treatment. And I like what Carter does here. I'm going to read maybe just a little bit out of here because there was some, and also to give you a little sample of her writing, which is just so good. You are always in danger in the forest where no people are. Step between the portals of the great pines where the shaggy branches tangle about you, trapping the unwary traveler in nets as if the vegetation itself were in a plot with the wolves who live there, as though the wicked trees go fishing on behalf of their friends. Step between the gateposts of the forest with the greatest of trepidation and infinite precautions, for if you stray from the path for one instant, the wolves will eat you. They are gray as famine, they are as unkind as plague. So I just love that. That of course, that's just a very small selection of a much larger series of paragraphs before the story even really begins, right? That sort of sets you up for it. And there's also this other one I think was really great. 7 years is a werewolf's natural span, but if you burn his human clothing, you condemn him to wolfishness for the rest of his life. So old wives hereabouts think it some protection to throw a hat or an apron at the werewolf, as if the clothes made the man. Yet by the eyes, those phosphorescent eyes, you know him in all his shapes, the eyes alone unchanged by metamorphosis. Before he can become a wolf, that lycanthrope strips stark naked. If you spy a naked man among the pines, you must run as if the devil were after you. And I really like that, although I don't know that we need the advice of if you spy a naked man in the pines, you need to run. I'm pretty sure we had that one down. But still, it's just so well written. And of course, that's all like building up, and then the story begins, right? The story of In the Company of Wolves, or The Company of Wolves. And then the last story in here, a particularly great one, is Wolf Alice. Wolf Alice is about a young girl who was raised by wolves up into, I guess, like almost like preteen. And then the wolf that had raised her, the mother wolf, is killed, and they find her and bring her to like some sort of monastery, and the nuns try to teach her how to be a human, and ultimately just not really having any success. They sort of turn her over to the Duke, who's a sort of werewolf himself, though it's not really clear that he kills anyone. It seems that the Duke goes out and eats and digs up bodies and eats the corpses. And really the story is just about her, this young girl, Wolf Alice, and her sort of like growing up and discovering who she is. And there's this fantastic little sequence where and there's where the Duke has a mirror, but the Duke casts no reflection, somewhat like a vampire. But Alice does, and how she notices her reflection, and it's like the process of her not understanding a reflection, and how long it takes her to finally figure out that her reflection is like her shadow. It's really her. It's not another person that she can play with and entertain. Like for a while, her reflection is her only friend, and how disappointed she is when she discovers that it is just like her shadow, just a part of her. I thought that was so good, so well done, so smoothly and precisely executed, so beautifully described. Such a real pleasure to read this. And like I said, I really feel like this is something that I'd want to go back and say, oh, I want to read that one short story right there. Not have to even give up very much time to go back and reread that story and really enjoy it. I think in the introduction here, Kelly Lankford says that she'll do like writing seminars, and she'll recommend The Woman in the House of Love, the vampire story. And I can absolutely see that. I can see that this is the kind of writing that it's like, you show someone something particularly fine and say, this is what you can achieve if you work hard enough. It's that kind of writing. It's really phenomenal and just such a pleasure. I mean, I would definitely say The Company of Wolves is the best werewolf story that I've read. And I would definitely want to read more Angela Carter. I'd be very interested to see how she does novels. I'd be very interested to see how that happens. I probably have announcements, but there's lots of good things, apart from the fact that Chris and I are talking about the third book of the new Sun, the Sword of the Lictor, over on his channel, and so that was a lot of fun. I recommend watching it because and that's what yeah, go watch it. I think it's cool. I've got some stuff coming in the mail, and I kind of want to talk about a few things. So I'll probably do like a small, like kind of like book haul. I don't know if it'll be small. I think it'll be small book haul like video coming up soonish. Also, I recently did that Neil Gaiman video. I honestly did not expect that video to do that well, really. So by the way, hello. So if you're new here, welcome. I really appreciate all the really wonderful comments and everything on that video. I got so many recommendations for good stuff to read. I kind of feel like I want to do something with that, but I don't really know. It seems strange or difficult for me to talk at any amount of length about something I just haven't read at all and don't even own. But that doesn't mean I don't want to do it. I still feel like maybe we can do something with that. Thanks very much. My name is Virgil, and this is Literally Books. A like and subscribe is appreciated. Thank you very much for your time. That's all for now. Bye.